Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm George Hamilton with Julia Blaze. So I am the Director of Product Marketing with Chronosphere. I started at Chronosphere in May of 2022. Before that, I worked at a couple other different startups in the data analytics space, the DevOps space. I worked at Cloud Health by VMware, so understanding the cost of all of that stuff. And prior to that, don't hold it against me, but I was an industry analyst for about 8 years covering application performance monitoring. So this is all very near and dear to my heart. Julia, you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, George. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Blaze. I'm a product manager here at Chronosphere. I also joined in May of 2022, and I work primarily with our control plane features. So my job is really to understand what observability managers need to know about their systems and give them the tools so that they can better distinguish signal from noise. Before Chronosphere, I was at another startup for 6 years. And before that, I was a librarian, which is, of course, the classic path into an observability career. But really love it here and excited to be here and speak with everyone today.
Yeah, the librarians do observe everything, right? So what we'll be covering, right? So some of this is, a little bit of motherhood and apple pie, and you'll get this, but some of it hopefully you'll kind of understand some of what the hidden costs of observability are. So, what's driving that data growth, what the hidden costs are, and then what is the true cost and what kind of return on an investment that you can expect by adopting cloud native observability. And we feature some content here today from very recently completed total economic impact report from Forrester Research. So we commissioned Forrester, they interviewed a bunch of our customers, created a composite organization, and they were able to kind of assess what the total economic impact of Chronosphere and cloud native observability was for these companies. So we'll show you that a little later on to kind of bring this all together. But first, the basic stuff, right, is that the big problem that we're experiencing, right, is that observability data today is growing faster than the data being generated by your applications and your infrastructure. It's growing 2 to 3 times faster. So this creates an issue where all of a sudden companies are seeing that the costs of maintaining their observability platform and managing all of that are actually more than the cost of their infrastructure. For the same level of footprint in their cloud environment, the move to containers and microservices from VMs and monolithic apps, all of a sudden your cloud costs stay relatively close to what they've been, or the rate of growth is fairly consistent, but your observability data costs actually go through the roof, and actually will outpace your infrastructure and apps. But we're adopting cloud native for good reasons, right? We want speed, we want efficiency, we want to innovate faster, we want competitive advantage. But now everyone's environment is far more complex than it's ever been. Infrastructure is running on containers now. Containers are ephemeral in nature. They scale dynamically. They may only exist for a few minutes or a few seconds at a time. And this creates some really unique operational challenges. On top of that, your applications are now built using microservices, which and there's many more interdependencies. No single person really knows how all of these systems interact and all fit together. So even though you're kind of giving the business that kind of speed, the agility that they want, when there is an incident, for example, your shopping cart or an order processing service, something breaks down on your e-commerce site, it's nearly impossible to figure out where to go to fix the problem. And this is despite the fact that you have access to more data than you've ever had. Each container microservice is emitting as many metrics, if not more, as a single monolithic VM-based application used to. So as a result, on-call developers who aren't familiar with this level of scale, complexity, and everything else in the environment often don't even know where to begin when a problem arises. So engineers from other parts of the organization get pulled away. You're always escalating to higher level people. They're pulled away from their day job to help troubleshoot all these things. The central observability team is trying to support the engineers, but they're dealing with a whole bunch of other stuff that goes on. I know Julia knows this very well from her previous role before joining Chronosphere. Dashboards load slow or they don't load at all. Queries time out. You also have poor availability of the observability system itself. We've had some customers, I think, that prior to working with Chronosphere had about like their observability system stayed up about 90% of the time, which is like crazy. That it's that unreliable. And if you're hosted, your observability and your applications are hosted in the same environment, and the app goes down in that environment, your observability goes down with it, and you're basically flying blind. This is something we've had folks that we've talked to before becoming customers that have actually told us that of that experience. So the majority of the time, the central observability team is spent maintaining and troubleshooting the observability system itself. So you end up with the business people are upset, the application owners are upset. More importantly, it's your customers that are frustrated, they're unable to interact with your company. It has a huge impact on your technical team, on your customers, and ultimately it affects the business. So you lose revenue, there's customer churn, longer mean time to detect and mean time to repair, your engineers stuck in toil instead of doing cool, innovative things. It also takes longer for engineers to ramp up in this type of environment and be productive. And the bottom line is your costs get a lot higher. I think, anything you want to add to that, Julia? I think I've kind of been talking a lot, right?
No, I think that's all correct. And, we are also here to talk about some of the influencers of this complexity that you may not have been thinking about, or you've just started sort of dipping your toes into these waters. But you're exactly correct that the outcome is, unfortunately, lack of understanding of your own system and lack of ability to serve your customers and drive your business in the direction that you want to drive it. I think let's move on to the next section here, because I'm going to briefly mention one factor in growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the question comes up, like, how did we end up in this? Because observability was supposed to help with this. And when your existing observability software, when you initially invested in it, the costs were likely in line with the value that you were receiving. And so all of this has kind of thrown that value equation kind of out of balance. So as the data grows and the volumes grow, again, your observability costs end up exceeding your infrastructure and application costs, and it just gets out of whack. So I know ESG did a survey in 2021, and they found out 71% of companies were concerned about observability data growth. Sure. And PagerDuty found that 68% of companies actually, even with all of this data available to them, they saw an increase in customer-facing incidents in the past 12 months. So yes, Captain Obvious, it's all pretty obvious stuff, right? But now we really kind of want to transition and talk about, given all of that, what are some of the not so obvious hidden costs that add up over time, where to look for them, and what you can do about them. And that's where I'll hand things off to Julia here to kind of talk about the first one here in Cardinality.
Thanks, George. So I think this, and for a little more color, in my previous company, I did work on the observability team, and I worked on that team at a time when we were transitioning from this more traditional infrastructure that you see on the left to a containerized infrastructure that you see on the right of this slide. And we learned a lot as part of that transition. And I think something that we really weren't accounting for in our initial migration was the cardinality of your data as you move into this containerized world. So this is a bit of a surprise to us, I think, for a few different reasons. Number one, actually, probably the reason that was less of a hidden cost and more of an obvious cost is more cardinality equals more data, right? George, you just talked about data growth. Cardinality is a big part of data growth as you move into a containerized and microservices world. The more unique values you have, the more the data that you're storing, and the more you have to pay for it and dig through it to find the signal that you need. I think some of the hidden costs that Cardinality add, especially are more along the lines of the rate of change of your system. So if you have a containerized infrastructure, if you have a business where you're trying to dynamically scale up and down in response to traffic, all of that adds just complexity, more pod names, more unique pod names that change all of the time, things that have different versions existing in different parts of your infrastructure that become harder and harder to trace to their cost of origin. So I think while Cardinality is a fairly obvious contributor to data growth, a less obvious way that it contributes to your hidden costs is that it adds a lot to your data complexity and to the management overhead. How do you find the signal in this increased complexity? How do you dig through it and set up reliable rules and reliable dashboards when these names change all the time? We all have custom metrics in our system. If you add containerized infrastructure on top of your custom metrics, on top of infrastructure that's auto-scaling, on top of frequent releases and re-releases of software applications, which all ultimately will be very valuable to your business. Unfortunately, what you can lose along the way is the ability to understand where the problem is and what you can do to fix it. And you end up spending, I think, a lot of manual time working to build a system that can handle that complexity, which I think gets into kind of our next section here in terms of the hidden costs. And that's really the administration. Now, there are a couple of different ways you may be managing your observability today. I know in my previous role, we actually had a mix of ways, right? We had some homegrown, internally built solutions for some subsets of our data. We also had some third-party vendors that we hired to handle different parts of our observability data. And we sort of knit them together into this framework because we thought, well, there are some things that we can do more cheaply than we can pay someone else to do them for us. But I think that was something that was a mistake because we didn't really realize that the costs of administration for an internally built system will also scale as you move into that containerized infrastructure and deal with these problems of cardinality and growth. And I think this, right, we're all familiar with internally built systems. You build the service, you stand up the infrastructure, you do the networking to connect it to your other systems. You make sure that it gets the regular security patches, that it gets scanned, that it's getting updates. Well, when you're building an internal system that's designed to handle VM scale data, those are things that we can stay on top of relatively easily. When you build it to handle something like your observability across all of your containerized infrastructure, those administrative costs scale quickly as well. Something else here that I really love to call people's attention to is this last bullet point, hiring, training, and retraining the talent. This is actually something that is a huge amount of overhead and cost for your system, right? Finding good people, managing those people, making sure that they're successful, that they're excited, that they're not burnt out because they're answering pages because your observability system keeps falling over on your busiest days of the year. That can be exhausting, and that can be a huge time sink and honestly a financial sink for your company if you're spending so many people's time just setting up and administering your internally grown observability system.
That's all right. And I agree 100%. And like, you're kind of an example, Julia, too, right? Like Chronosphere has actually benefited from some of this engineering toil in other places by recruiting former SREs to join our company because they got tired of missing their kids' birthday parties and being called in on weekends and nights and holidays, trying to keep systems up and running. It's we're hearing this more and more from the customers that we talk to about engineering burnout and what they can do to try and take some of the burden, especially off their most talented people, because when they leave, it really leaves a hole behind in their company. And I think one of the biggest challenges and what's really costly for a lot of these companies is trying to scale the environment and maintaining reliability while you scale. And so I'm going to use like Prometheus as kind of an example to show like this is something that if you're doing this on your own, and you have to try and scale this. Here are some of the things just that you have to consider that you may not think of and that can get pretty costly. So as you scale Prometheus, it's pretty common that a service will start producing just a lot more metrics. And of course, a single prom instance may not be able to handle that load. So the workaround is you create a separate prom instance and you have that instance store and scrape metrics from that particular service while having the original prom instance store and scrape metrics for the other services. And this will manually shard the load across a fleet of prom instances. This can get challenging for a number of reasons, right? And the first is, of course, just from a dashboarding and alerting perspective. You need to tell each dashboard or alert which prom instance to point to get the data. All the dashboards were originally pointed to that first prom instance, and now the data set is sharded. So you need to change the source in your dashboard to where the data is coming in for all the data for, say, for service A. And in addition, now all that historical data doesn't get transferred for service A. So you only get the new data. And the same thing happens with alerting. So another administrative headache is when a single dashboard or alert from both prom instances, like if you're summing across services, you need to make sure all the data goes to a single place. So you'll have to create a third instance, which is federating your instances. so that you can see a view across both instances. And so this picks a subset of data for the original instances. And this allows you to query the third instance with a subset of data from all the services. The problem, however, of course, is that you still only have a subset of data in the federated instance. So if you need more data than what's in that node, you need to also query and point your alerts to the original or the original instances. The bottom line is the management of this and knowing which instance has which data, which ones have an overlap of data, it gets very, very hard to manage. And actually, Julia will talk a little bit more about this and how difficult it can be just from a data management perspective. And then when you begin to scale this up, it leads to more federated nodes, much more complicated Prometheus infrastructure. And as you do this across zones or regions, then you need to federate the data in another prom instance and combine that across both zones or regions. You need to remember which prom instance contains the data you're looking for. So it just becomes a nightmarish environment to manage internally. You're spending a lot of cycles on this. And honestly, one of our customers actually gave the best quote for this, which is, we're not going to benefit by building our own monitoring stack, and they have the engineering ability to do that. We just don't want to. It's not something that is a value add to the organization. That's engineering toil is what that comes down to. Now, I know, Julia, you've had you mentioned kind of both do-it-yourself, open source with SaaS APM tools. This is now kind of talking about the SaaS APM piece of this and packaged applications and what's challenging for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to speak briefly to your previous slides, I will also add, I knew SREs on our teams who maintained hand-drawn maps of their Prometheus setup for different environments in order to make sure they could pass along the knowledge, or so that if they had to go on vacation and something went wrong, someone else could step in. It was kind of funny at times to see the very old school methods that we had to resort to manage the knowledge of how our system was set up and pass on administrative tasks from one team member to another. So we did, in some cases, like I said before, turn to these third-party tools and SaaS vendors. I think something that we did note, though, is these are not without costs. These are not without administrative costs of their own. And depending on the vendor, that's going to look a little bit different. There's, of course, payment. You have to pay these services. That's how they make their money. We respect that. We're Chronosphere. We also provide a service, but the different payment models can be more or less transparent. And I think that's something that you really have to go into with eyes wide open, survey the market, talk to other people using this vendor, understand what their base price captures and represents for you and how that scales up over time. I think depending on the pricing model, you can also work with vendors who will say, well, right, you have this price for this amount of services per year. And if you go over, we are just going to charge you. And initially you might think, oh, well, that's well over what I spent last year. I'm never going to get overcharged. And then July comes around and all of a sudden you've scaled up and your business is doing well, which is great, but you produce a massive burst of metrics. Your observability grows dramatically or spikes in a single month, and all of a sudden you're getting overcharged. So I think really being aware of some of the pricing models, the ways that you can get asked to pay for more than you anticipated, especially on an emergency basis where it's like, oh, you already went over, so you are already being overcharged, and you don't have the ability to understand and set a limit, understand when you're getting to that overcharge point and have a discussion before those charges show up on your account. And that's an administrative cost of its own, right? Is understanding those models and shaping your system and team to be responsive to them. I think to that second point here, dashboard and tool sprawl, depending on your vendor, they may provide different kinds of tools to manage your data, dashboards to see your data, ways to organize your dashboards into lists, or they may not. And you may have things that, especially over time, really go into or devolve into classic entropy scenarios, right? Where all of a sudden you have, instead of the beautiful 100 perfectly curated set of dashboards you start out with, teams have changed, people have created new things, new metrics have come on, people have tried to combine dashboards into one, not everything's been on the list, someone's been in someone's personal environment and hasn't been shared with their team. And none of those are curated, but they are what people are using. And with that lack of curation comes confusion when it comes time to debug. Who's looking at what root cause pattern in what dashboard? It can also lead to more escalations to power users because you don't necessarily understand if what you're looking at is the right thing to be looking at. You need to go hunt and peck through your organization to find the person who wrote the software, who may have written the initial dashboard, who could tell you if this is valuable signal or not. And this just becomes increasingly difficult to manage over time, depending on your vendor's solutions and ability to help you manage that entropy. And finally, I think this hidden cost, which may not be as hidden depending on what you used before, is vendor lock-in, right? You use third-party tools. They often have custom languages, custom setup, and you need to find staff that know these tools, train your staff on those tools if they don't already know them, and then maybe even instrument your own platform to suit the vendor's needs. So if they're using a specific language or a specific format, you might need to set up all your infrastructure to work with that format. If they have, for instance, something like a sampling algorithm that says, I'm going to keep X% of your data in order to keep you to a reasonable cost, right? Back to that first column, I'm going to downsample based on some reasons. And you say, oh, how do I change those reasons? How do I impact what's kept and what's thrown away as signal or noise? And the answer may be either you can't, or you have to instrument your data to add certain tags or to change certain things so that our algorithm captures it. And all of a sudden your data is being emitted in this proprietary format. Maybe it's using proprietary pipelines. And I would say one more hidden cost that surprised us is sometimes you're with a vendor, you're with them for 6 months, they come out with a new feature, and now that new feature actually asks you to install more of their software in your network boundary, manage that infrastructure yourself, manage the releases, manage the patches, and all of a sudden you have actually both situations happening at once. You have a third-party vendor and you have infrastructure that you're managing, but now they built that infrastructure for you and you're dependent on them for patches and bug resolutions while you are in charge of the cost of maintaining it. So I think third-party vendors can be a great solution depending on what you're looking for, but there are some administrative costs to keep in mind as you go into that relationship and as you look at what they provide. We highly recommend that you evaluate these things and think about your team's time and your data instrumentation and all of the costs of managing that team and managing that data to fit with your third-party vendor's solution. And this gets me to my other favorite hidden cost of managing observability data, especially in this complex world. You may have heard me allude to it, but in this world of data growth, data complexity, different proprietary formats, dashboard entropy over time, I have found, at least in my experience and that of a few of my colleagues in this industry, that being on an observability team becomes maybe 40% advising and managing and working with people on how to use their data to drive the business forward, and 60% troubleshooting. I cannot tell you how many times I came into work and I had 5 different Slack messages and 2 emails. Hey, where's this metric? Where did this go? I swear it was here last week. Why can't I find it again? Sometimes it's urgent because someone's trying to root cause an incident that's happening and we need to get on top of it. Sometimes someone's just curious and they haven't been there in a while and they don't quite know how to find the answer for themselves. But just troubleshooting the system and understanding what is a bug versus an intentional decision becomes a huge part of your time. I think too, what can happen here is really the cost of both that time spent as a help desk for your tools, whether it's an internal tool or a third-party tool. But it also is, I think of it as an underemployment problem for your company as well. You're spending a lot of your time on troubleshooting and help desk management and, pin the tail on the, why did this metric go somewhere else? Where did it go? Who did it? But you're also using your time there when your company could be using your time for something bigger and something more valuable. And again, you are spending your time as a traffic manager and a troubleshooter, and you're not spending your time as a strategic advisor trying to help people understand what to use and what to capture and how to shape their system to get them the signal that they need. And I think just adds to that administrative cost, almost a separate category because of all the time you might end up spending. And I think it's really important to understand whatever system you choose at the end of the day, understand exactly what rules are in place, exactly what metrics are where, and how to root cause and find metrics for people who may not know how to do it on their own. Either you need to know how to do that, or you need to know that your system will make that really transparent or provide you with a customer support team that will help you with that, because that does become a lot of your time. It can be hard, it can be overcome, but I don't think any of us really want to spend our time chasing service owners to find the data that someone needs for triage.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. And it's a really good point too that you called out, that it's something that you may intentionally do. You make a choice to not collect certain data. You're trying to reduce your costs, and it can be inadvertent. And in either case, um, it just drives huge administrative costs. So what are some of the pro tips? And of course, our recommendation, of course, is choose a fully managed service. And also note the pricing model. Julia alluded to this earlier, right? Look at, do they charge for ingest and then persistent storage on top of it? We know a lot of vendors do. But if you can get that we are only paying for the data that's valuable to you, ask that question, and ask about overages and what they are. And those are all unexpected costs. Maintain compatibility with open source standards at the front end, back end, and everything in between. You want to have 100% open source compatibility. This is the direction the world is going. As Julie just alluded to, the transparent data management. You need full visibility into what metrics, how you control and shape the data to make it valuable for everybody in your organization to use, and be able to trace that and optimize your retention and the resolution of that data, and practice good data aggregation practices. And so we're kind of coming up to the really valuable stuff here. So in a moment, we'll show you some of the results of the total economic impact report. But based on everything we've shown so far, like, how do you fix this problem that, observability was supposed to solve, and it's actually adding to your cost? So here we are back at our nice little layer cake slide, and your cost of value ratio is still terribly out of whack. This is the exact problem that Chronosphere is designed to solve. So to help you get your costs back in line and improve problem identification and problem resolution, because at the end of the day, that's what you care about, is finding these things quickly and then being able to resolve them quickly. And so with Chronosphere, you can still collect all of that same data, but it's aggregated and it's transformed and shaped into information that is actually usable by your developers. And it's also a way to reduce your data footprint tremendously without, and while simultaneously improving those key troubleshooting metrics. And so it gets that cost to value ratio back in line. And at the same time, like I said, you're improving your troubleshooting metrics like MTTD and TTR. You get happier customers, happier revenue. You get happier, more productive engineers who don't miss as many kids' birthdays and holidays and aren't being paged in the middle of the night. And your on-call people can be more productive and not have to escalate as often. You can democratize the usage of observability, but reduce all that toil and get your engineers back to doing the stuff that adds value to your company. And your observability costs will actually go down. And the way we accomplish this is the Chronosphere, and we'll give you our little product pitch here before we get to the really cool ROI stuff, right? So humor us for a bit, right? But it's a cloud native observability platform. You ingest all that metric, trace data, all open standards compatible. And I think the important thing here, right, is we're different from a lot of observability solutions that we were born in the cloud, developed the engineers at Uber who know how to build massive systems that scale and are reliable. And in addition, one of the more recent enhancements in the platform is actually being able to put the right data in context. In a lot of observability platforms, engineers log in and it is overwhelming. There is so much data, or they have this service catalog or whatever interface they have with it, it is almost impossible to know where to go first. Or there's, 100 dashboards that are all just tweaked a little bit. Which one is the right dashboard that I need to go to help me solve this problem? So Chronosphere helps you put that data in context so that as an engineering team, an alert, you get it, and you're now brought to the data that is most relevant to that problem at hand. It saves a lot of time navigating the whole sea of data that you have. And helps drive engineers through the observability lifecycle so that they know about the problems via alerts. They can triage that problem by navigating through their dashboards, traces, and then be able to perform root cause analysis. And on average, our customers see about a 50% reduction in the time spent troubleshooting. That's from our own customer base. So a huge difference in just time spent troubleshooting. And a lot of that secret sauce comes from the control plane, which of course, Julia is the product manager for. And it's a very unique capability. And it's what gives you that power to transform your observability data based on need, context, and the utility of that data. So you analyze usage, the value of your data, and then you can determine what is useful and what can be aggregated. And the bottom line, the result is you reduce your costs, you improve the user experience, and you, of course, the holy grail, right? Solving problems faster by giving teams fast access to the right data. And on average, Chronosphere customers, this is directly from our customers as well, some get better numbers than this, but on average, customers reduce their data set by 48% with Chronosphere, while improving their observability metrics. And the last thing I'll touch on, and I touched on it a little bit, right, is just the reliability of the platform itself. So promised SLAs are one thing, delivered SLAs are something completely different, right? There's a lot of companies that can promise SLAs, and they're more than happy to be able to issue credits after outages because they just want to be able to post that great SLA that they offer. It doesn't do you any good when you're consistently having reliability issues and getting service credits. That's just not sustainable. Our promised SLA is 3 nines, and we've actually consistently delivered 4 nines to our customer base. It's actually a little bit better than 4 nines. So that's a pretty impressive number. It is one of the most efficient engines that we have for collecting and storing data at scale. And I mentioned this, right? We learned how to do like industrial, highly performant, highly available storage from building M3 at Uber. And we do all this with no vendor lock-in, right? All the ins, outs of the platform, leverage open source standards, from ingestion to querying, the query builder built on PromLens, which has been open sourced, to dashboarding, alerting. Everything is all supporting open source standards. Julie, if I missed anything, you are free to point it out. I just covered your product.
No, I think you hit on all the high points. I think it is rewarding to work with our customers and see them use these tools to achieve this data reduction. I'll say more than that. It's not really data reduction, it's noise reduction. And I talk about that a lot because it's all about, getting the signal from the noise. Some data is useful, some isn't. That's okay. And we don't want you to have to keep around the unimportant data. We don't want to charge you for the unimportant data. We want to help you find the data that's going to be really useful in driving your business forward and make that data easy for people to access, easy to use, and have that be the thing that you're paying us for, is finding and making best use of the data that's required for you to run your business. It really is our philosophy. It's one of the reasons I joined this company, because I really appreciated that motivation and that direction that the product was going. So I appreciate you sharing this, and I do appreciate everyone listening to our brief sales pitch for ourselves, because it is something that I've really enjoyed about working here, and that's held true both from the outside when I was first looking at Chronosphere and from the inside as a product manager here.
That's awesome. So let's get to this a little bit. We've thrown a lot at you, but how do we put some hard numbers to this? Actually, we've talked a lot about these hidden costs, what to look for. And so we worked with Forrester. We commissioned Forrester to create a total economic impact study. So you may be familiar with this. They do this for a lot of companies. And I think it's a great model that they use because the vendor has very limited in sway in how this is built out, other than us giving them customers to interview and giving them how much our pricing model. They pretty much do this on their own with very little input from us, which is a nice thing to do because it gives you kind of a real good look. And it the results from this study were pretty eye-opening even for us. I mean, the return on investment of 165% with a payback period less than 6 months, and an NPV of 4.9 million, which for you who may have forgotten your college finance course, our typical organization that Forrester interviewed received benefits of 7.9 million over a 3-year period versus upfront costs of $3 million. So you do the math, that's 4.9 million of net present value, which is a measure of how valuable your future investments are in today's dollars. So that's some pretty impressive statistics. And So a little bit about the methodology, just so you're familiar with it, right? So Forrester interviewed 5 Chronosphere customers, and they were a mix of pure born in the cloud companies as well as enterprises making the transition to cloud native. And then what they do is they create a single composite organization based on that they can actually build a model on to determine what the economic impact is of implementing cloud native observability, generally in Chronosphere specifically. So the composite organization they came up with based on those interviews was about $1 billion in annual revenue, a generic B2C multinational company at around 5,000 employees. On average, 60% of the metrics that they ingest are persisted or put into storage. So that's another key thing to think about is Chronosphere does not charge you for ingest. We charge you for persisted storage. Only the data that is valuable and usable to you are you paying for. There's no ingest fees. That is a unique thing, and it is a significant cost, especially when you see the growth of the metrics data that experienced by these customers, which is growing. They were basically doubling their metrics volume every year over a 3-year period. And so the results, the first one was they had about a 40% reduction in stored metrics data, which is huge. And a lot of that is basically cost savings from having that only paying for what's persisted versus paying for ingest plus persisted. And so a lot of that benefits come from roll up, from the better quality of that stored data and the ability to scale. This one was a really powerful statistic, and you'll actually see who actually said this, but in the case study that we show, a 75% reduction in severe events. Those are like Sev 0, Sev 1 events, 75% reduction in that. And so there's a whole host of benefits that come from that. One is just the cost of chasing down the issues, your engineering teams, but you're also avoiding, they give a certain calculation on how much of that revenue that you lose during an outage is recoverable, and not all of it is. There's certainly some. So there's a give in there that they say some of that is recoverable, but even still, it's a huge impact during critical events to prevent any of that non-recoverable revenue from being lost permanently. And 65% less time spent on administration. Julie and I have kind of harped on this quite a bit over the course of the slides, right? The administrative headache of managing this, as well as your other SaaS-based APM tools. Organizations with Chronosphere actually reduced administration time 65%. So the improved reliability, reduced incidents, it just gives a lot of time back to key people. And there's a lot less time spent doing triage during downtime events, because there's fewer events, of course. And with the data being in the right context, you can get to the right data much faster. So those are the big results from Forrester's study. And we'll share a link in a moment so you can get more info on that study. And so here's Robinhood. So you can see where that 75% reduction came from. This was Robinhood specifically saying 75% of their what they would call critical events, Sev 0, Sev 1, they eliminated, which is really remarkable. And mean time to detect, a 4x improvement on that. Their query latency, we never even mentioned Query Accelerator, which Julia also worked on and launched successfully at KubeCon recently, but improved the performance of their dashboards and queries by a factor of 8. And they saved $15 million compared to managing this in-house. So huge benefits across the board. And Query Accelerator was a new capability that we announced fairly recently that will actually automatically scan your environment, and where a query can be accelerated via aggregation will actually be able to deliver a faster performance for your queries that load into dashboards. So a lot less engineer idle time waiting for a dashboard to load or getting frustrated that the dashboard didn't load at all. And so the bottom line, and again, we'll just give you our very brief little picture and then I'll give you the contact info, right? You can see that the big companies that have used us here at the bottom, it's about being able to control and shape your data. So you get the data that's usable for you, as Julia said, getting that signal from the noise, having a very reliable platform that delivers 4 nines so that your observability is more reliable than your production environment. Making sure that the data is in context and not just a huge amount of data that you're trying to swim through to find the right data at the right time. Again, improving all those key metrics of being able to detect, being able to triage and get to the root cause of issues. And the customer success team, which we've barely touched upon, Julia mentioned the need for it, about working with our customers to help them really to harness the power of the control plane, to make sure that they're doing the right things with aggregation and roll-up rules, et cetera, to get the most out of the platform and make sure they're capturing all of the most relevant and important data for their developers to use. We really feel like cloud native observability is not an afterthought. It's actually a means to a competitive advantage. It really is when you are embracing cloud native. It can mean the difference in a user experience. And with that, we'll take a couple of questions, some of the key content that you can poke around on. First of all, the Forrester total, and they'll share these slides out after the webcast so that you'll have these links directly. But we do have the Forrester Total Economic Impact report on our website. There's also an ROI calculator estimator that you can actually go in and put in your data, like that we showed in that report, the results from this composite organization, and you can actually go in and put in what your environment looks like in the data you're capturing and persisting, and get an estimate on what Chronosphere could actually return for you. So I encourage you to check that out. It's brand new. The calculator is live now, and we'll actually have more coming up in the next week or two on this as well. There's a really cool ebook there. Of course, you can just poke around on our site and schedule time, and actually we can set up a meeting and do a demo of the platform. One little call out, I don't have a landing page for this yet, but we do have, because I mentioned some stuff about Prometheus and Julia talked a little bit about managing it in her environment. We have a new webinar coming up. Just look out for it, January 19th, with Julius Foles, who is the founder of PromLens, and one of the creators of Prometheus and one of the leaders in this industry, and has done some work with us on, and we recently open sourced the Query Builder PromLens, and there'll be a good session on kind of getting back to some of the basics of Prometheus and getting started with it. So if you're in that space where you're actually just dipping your toe in the water there, that might be a good session to check out. He has some good tips and tricks for getting started and how to avoid some of the pitfalls while you try to scale that environment. And with that, we can turn to questions.
Great. So we have some questions coming in. So let's take it from top. The first question, do you have the comparison data between Chronosphere and the Grafana lab?
I wasn't sure I heard the question correctly.
The comparison data between Chronosphere and the Grafana lab.
That is a very broad question, so it's really hard to answer. We don't have, you could actually talk to one of our reps here. I would recommend you do if you want to try to do a comparison of Chronosphere versus Grafana. We actually will support Grafana dashboards in our environment, and we're actually building some other dashboards as well that are not Grafana. And we also have a new kind of user interface for the Chronosphere platform that will be available in early January. But again, because of our nature of supporting open source across the board, many of our customers are actually using Grafana dashboards with Chronosphere being the engine underneath and using Grafana for their dashboards. But if you wanted to get a more direct comparison, if you're evaluating the different tools, we can certainly help you with that. I would probably reach out to the links that we provided in the webinar.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, George. And also we will reach out to you to really provide more like the detailed information. We will talk with our sales team to contact you. So next question, how is the Chronosphere deployed and what do I have to install?
The only thing that you as a customer have to worry about are the collectors. It's a fully managed service, so everything is hosted in the cloud. So if you're already instrumented with Prometheus, the transition to Chronosphere from a do-it-yourself managed environment is actually, that's what we do all the time. So the only thing that you have to maintain are the collectors. Everything else is hosted in the cloud. It's a fully managed service.
Okay. Next question. I need advice for how I manage a system that have both traditional Vim-based deployments and also the containerized.
I can take this one, George. I think speaking from my own experience, I think a critical thing if you're managing infrastructure that is split is to try to align your observability data with the way that your business is organized. So think about who your teams are, what services they own. Those people are going to have the expertise in their tools and the ability to do more of that sifting through noise. And I would try to make sure that you can align both the observability for a single team coming from traditional infrastructure and the observability for those services that may belong to that team but are in the process of migrating. Make sure those are getting really surfaced up in the same dashboards, accounted for with the same methods. And if you can, I think depending on what tooling you're using, try to align the tools so that one team isn't trying to switch back and forth between one platform tool and one internally managed tool, but instead can see their data across platforms all in one place. It's certainly something that we've helped customers with in the past as well. So if you are in the middle of a transition, we can work with you, or you can speak with one of us to work out how we can help you align that data with those people who know the most about it so that they can continue delivering value, even if you're in the middle of migrating your infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Julia. So we have the next question will be, any labs available to get the feel of the product?
Are there any labs available to? We are actually starting to work on that for the first part of 2023. So I appreciate you asking the question. We're actually going to start doing some kind of workshop kind of environments. And so stay tuned for more info on that. There's not like a demo environment you can just go to, but we could actually, again, we'll follow up after the webinar and we can actually give you more detail on how we can get you a demo, how we actually do pilot projects, and how you can actually begin to evaluate the software. There are ways we can make that happen. There's not a published like sandbox somewhere that you can just go to. It wouldn't be that easy to get up and running, but we can actually certainly help you take a look at the product and get your hands on it in some way. So we'll follow up after the event.
Okay, thank you, George. So we still have time for one more question. How difficult is it to migrate from an existing APM to?
Julie, I can start and you can certainly add some color here. We do have a customer success organization that has actually done this for several of our existing customers. So it really depends on the nature of the environment. But there is like a migration service that we actually have with our customer success organization. They're well versed in it. And that's actually how, of course, if you're coming from Prometheus, it's of course easier, right? Because the instrumentation is already there and you're already working in a fully open sourced environment. Coming from a proprietary platform, there's a little bit more work to do, but we've done it with a few customers. And we do have a customer success organization. And again, we can follow up with more detail on that.
Okay, so Julia and George, thank you so much for going through everything today. We have addressed most of the questions, so we are going to wrap up at the Q&A at this point. I did mention at the beginning that we were doing a drawing for 100 and some gift cards, so I will go ahead and quickly announce the winner. Our first winner will be Bill M. And the second winner is Dan E. The third winner will be Jean Z. And the fourth and the final winner is Matthew Wei. So congratulations to all the winners. We will be reaching out to you with an email with instructions for claiming your gift card. So please keep an eye on your inbox. If you don't find the email, please check your spam folder. And Julia and George, any parting words or anything you'd like to the audience to know before we close out?
Just for me, thank you very much. Thanks for listening. Sorry if you didn't win a gift card, but hopefully you got value out of the session otherwise with Julie and me.
Yeah, thank you all very much for joining us today, for listening to us. If you're in the middle of one of these transitions or trying to work with your data in this new world and you're interested in more time with us, I know, again, our customer success team is really excellent and ready and available to answer your questions. So please reach out. Don't be a stranger. And thank you again for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.